So this evening, we are going to look at this paper that was published. I don't know how many of you have heard about this paper written by Dr. Fisman. I'm just going to read his summary. So he talks about using a mathematical model, and the title of the paper is Impact of Population Mixing Between Vaccinated and Unvaccinated Subpopulations on Infectious Disease Dynamics. It's an implication for SARS transmission. So basically, he is saying that using this model, you can understand the implications of the interplay between vaccinated and unvaccinated populations using different assumptions. So they constructed a model and they came to a conclusion. So I'll just briefly read the interpretation. Although the risk associated with avoiding vaccination during a virulent pandemic accrues chiefly to people who are unvaccinated, their choices affect the risk of viral infection among those who are vaccinated in a manner that is disproportionate to the portion of unvaccinated people. So basically, what they are saying is that unvaccinated people, even though they make up a very small percentage of the population right now, is causing a risk to vaccinated people. And so there are obviously many, many things that are wrong with this paper. And this evening, we are going to hear from Dr. Denis Rancourt first, who is going to talk about the model and the fatal flaw that is wrong with the model and how they can't actually come to the conclusion that they've come to. So Dr. Denis Rancourt has spoke to our group before, but I'll just give you a quick summary. He has a PhD in physics from the University of Toronto. He was a tenured full professor and researcher at the University of Ottawa for 23 years, and he's published many, many papers in areas of physics, chemistry, biogeochemistry, theoretical physics. And in the last couple of years, he's been very active in COVID-related research. And the paper, the rebuttal that he wrote to this article, he collaborated with Joseph Hickey, who I believe is also here this evening. And they collaborated to talk about what was wrong with the model with this research. And they are both part of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. And so perhaps, Joseph, since you're here, you might have a few comments after Denis is done explaining the flaws with the model. Okay, Denis, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to say a few words. I just want to mention that Joseph Hickey also has a PhD in physics. So we're both physicists, and physicists are people, especially, well, the two of us are people who really know mathematical models and models that are used to simulate reality and so on. So that's our job. That's our business. We understand the mathematical details of coupled differential equations and various kinds of simulations that you can do to model. And many people who work in the field who do models, I mean in the general field of epidemiology, who are modelers, do not understand the nuts and bolts of models to the degree that we do. So that's important to keep in mind. I'm sometimes shocked at some of the practitioners, the degree to which they don't understand their own models, but that's a separate point. I want to talk about this paper by Fisman et al. And I have to say that I'm outraged by the paper. I'm outraged by the language in the paper. I'm outraged by the weasel phrases and weasel words that are used, and the political nature of the writing. It is a despicable paper, and in an area where science can influence public policy and have really dramatic negative consequences. And so I blame the journal, the Canadian Medical Association Journal, for publishing this paper. I think it was highly irresponsible, and I believe the paper to be highly unethical. So let me explain what we found. What we found is that you see Fisman et al. Want to have it both ways. They want to write a paper in which they do incorrect mathematics, make incorrect interpretations of that mathematics, and then at the end conclude something which trivially follows from the basic model, which you can do. So they want to, on the one hand, say really outrageous things that are extreme based on incorrect approaches, and then at the end say, and therefore we conclude. In their conclusion is basically a political statement, which does, and they use it, they make their conclusion using they're lawyering their message, and they're using very political language so that they have plausible deniability. They can always say, oh no, we didn't say that, we said this, and so on. So the language is very disturbing. But what I want to get to is how bad the underlying error is, okay? So what they do is that they use a classic model, and it's a very well-known model, and the results and the various simulations and the results from this model are well-known. They're to the point of being trivial. I mean, it's a simple model, and the results that it can give are well-known. And if they wanted to simply publish that model as is, it would not normally be published because it's all just too well known, and all the results from the model are obviously follow from the model itself. But what they did is something else. They made it cross the barrier into publishable by introducing a new index, a new parameter that they introduce in an ad hoc way. So what they do is they take outcomes from their model, parameters that derive from the model when you put in the various epidemiological parameters, and then you get these predictions. They took those predictions and combined them in an unusual way to create a new index or a new parameter, which they call psi, and they call this psi unvaccinated contribution to infection risk. That's what they name it. And this new parameter has never been used before in epidemiological modeling. It's important to understand that there are no other papers. This is new. This is the novelty, if you like, in this paper. But the parameter is not what they say it is. And they interpret the parameter to mean something that it cannot possibly mean. And this is what we pointed out. We said, fine, you've got a model in the background there, but then you're taking output parameters from that, concocting this false parameter, then incorrectly interpreting what this false parameter means, and concluding some really radical things from that, making radical statements in the interpretation section of your paper, and then at the end, you conclude something with a language that allows you to get away with that. Okay, at the very end in the political conclusion statement. So that is the beast that we're working with. And of the many criticisms of this paper that I have seen, we are the only ones that have put our finger on that mathematical error, on that sleight of hand, if you like. And the reason they can get away with this is because nobody gets into the nuts and bolts of what they're actually doing. Nobody can actually evaluate it because the immunologists think in terms of immunology and in terms of the parameters that characterize a pandemic and so on. Everyone's thinking in terms of their own expertise, and we go in there and say, but what are you actually doing? What is this new parameter? What the heck is, how can you say it represents this? So just to be clear, I want to read something from their paper that is absolutely wrong. And I want to go on the record as saying this statement is absolutely incorrect. And it follows from their crazy, ad hoc, incorrect parameter and the incorrect interpretation of that parameter. And it's this statement here. It's in the interpretation section. So of the paper. So it's how they're interpreting things. And it's at the bottom of page 578. I'm just going to read what they say and then be critical of it. Here it is. And there are many incorrect statements exactly of this type, but this is one that really stands out for me. Here it is. I'm going to read the full statement. More like with like mixing decreased final epidemic size among vaccinated people. Well, that's true, and that's something that trivially follows from any model of this type, okay? But then he goes on to say, but he adds something to this. but resulted in enhancement of the degree to which risk among vaccinated people could be attributed to unvaccinated people. Now, I'm just going to pause and explain this. He is saying that as you segregate the two groups more and more, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, then as you segregate this, there's less risk to the vaccinated. That's obvious. That has to be true. But then he says, so he's admitting there's less risk to the vaccine, but he says, but this segregation in our model resulted in enhancement of the degree to which risk among vaccinated people could be attributed to unvaccinated people. Absolutely wrong. There is nothing in the model that shows that. And it does not follow from the model. It only follows if you badly interpret a concocted ad hoc parameter that you introduce that nobody else uses. Then you can by that road come to this false conclusion. So that does not follow from the model, but it's how they interpret things. And having made that statement, they can then emphasize this in a language that is more generic and where they get away with it in the conclusion statement of their paper. So this is a highly devious paper. You have to understand that you have to be not only a physicist, but a logician. You have to be an expert in logic. You have to be an expert in language. You have to be an expert in ethics to really appreciate how misleading this paper is. It's a terrible piece of work that should never have been published in a scientific journal. So that is an incorrect statement. But he goes on to add to this incorrect statement more incorrect statements. The next sentence immediately says the following. So remember, he just said that as you separate the two groups more and more, it resulted in enhancement of the degree to which risk among vaccinated people could be attributed to unvaccinated people, which is an absurdity, as we pointed out. This is like a complete absurdity, okay? But it only follows if you badly interpret an ad hoc parameter that you introduce, presumably to get this result. All right. Then the next sentence, listen to this. The fact that this excess contribution, he's talking about this excess contribution, which is absurd and which does not exist in the model. He says the fact that this excess contribution to risk cannot be mitigated by high like with like mixing undermines the assertion that vaccine choice is best left to the individual. I mean, you have to wrap your head around this. This is just unbelievable what they're saying here. They're saying that they have demonstrated a fact. They say the fact that this excess contribution to risk, they're saying as you separate the two populations more and more, there's an excess, an enhanced contribution to risk. And this cannot be mitigated by even more segregation, by high like with like mixing. Okay? So he's saying that as you separate the two groups more and more, there's an enhanced, let's say, poison coming from unvaccinated people that is coming in because you're separating the two groups more and more. And that extra poison, he's saying, you cannot mitigate it by separating them even more. This is a complete absurdity. And we showed that this parameter psi, which they have, shoots up as you separate the two groups more and more. This is where he's getting it. He's got a figure to that effect. And we said, well, this makes no sense. In fact, you can have complete, when the maximum value of this poison from unvaccinated people occurs is with complete segregation. So when you're completely segregated, when you're completely separated, when you have no contact whatsoever with the unvaccinated, then they are contributing the maximum in a disproportionate way to the risk to yourself. This is what the model is saying. This is what how they're interpreting their ad hoc parameter, which is false. And we went on in our very short paper, which is published on the website of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, we went on to show, or to explain rather, how this parameter is defined, and why therefore it makes no sense. And what they do is, this is crazy. they are defining this psi in the following way. I know this is really technical, and I know that many of you are not going to follow it, and I understand that. It takes scientists a while to wrap their heads around what they actually did, okay? But here's what they did. Their psi is equal to the following thing. It's equal to the ratio of infections to vaccinated people from unvaccinated people divided by all infections to vaccinated people. So there's that ratio. But then they multiply this, if you like, or rather they divide it by another ratio. And that other ratio is the number of contacts between vaccinated and unvaccinated people divided by the total number of contacts that vaccinated people had. So they're taking something which properly represents the risk contribution, if you like, from unvaccinated people, and they're dividing it by this weird ratio that looks at the numbers of contacts. And that division, that denominator there, you can't do that because the resulting ratio of ratios makes no sense and doesn't mean what they say it means. It blows up as you separate the two groups, and it goes to zero risk as the epidemic becomes more and more virulent as you increase R0, which is the reproduction number of for the infection. So we showed that if you were to believe what they say this parameter means, it leads you to ridiculous, absurd, impossible conclusions. And we showed why this parameter made no sense. And we said their main interpretation comes from this parameter, badly interpreting this parameter. And then, having made these egregiously wrong statements about what's going on based on an ad hoc parameter badly interpreted, then they write their political conclusion at the end, the little paragraph at the end, in a way that makes it sound like it's just the simple result of one of these standard models. You can't have it both ways. You can't say we're just presenting the standard model, which everyone does all the time, and therefore it's new and you should publish it. Or we've got something new, but we're going to pretend that it just gives the same thing at the end when we conclude. I mean, it's just that kind of paper. It's just a horrible piece of. Okay, I won't say the word, but let me read their conclusion at the conclusion section. Okay, the thing that really stands out in the way they say it. Okay, so they say the choice of some individuals to refuse vaccination, get this, is likely to affect the health and safety of vaccinated people in a manner disproportionate to the fraction of unvaccinated people in the population. All right. So that statement is going to be true, trivially true, anytime that there are more infectious unvaccinated people in the population that is mixing than there are infectious vaccinated people. So like it's a trivial statement, but epidemiologists would never say it that way because they would never put the word disproportionate in there because it's an obvious statement. So what does disproportionate mean? Why are they putting that word in there? Well, in the context of the paper as a whole, you have to understand their reason for putting that word in as how they mean disproportionate in the rest of the paper. And how they mean disproportionate in the rest of the paper is in relation to this false parameter psi. So an ethical epidemiologist who is working on a standard model like this and wants to say that your risk to being infected depends on how many people that are infected that you come into contact with, which is an obvious thing, they would not use the word disproportionate. They would say it's an obvious thing that blah, 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 you see? So he is trying to give himself plausible deniability. He's trying to make a statement at the end which is broad, overreaching, and cannot be criticized. So you can't criticize his conclusion. So this is this is what convinced me that the man is a weasel. This is what happened. We wrote this very accurate paper about this error. We submitted it as a comment to the journal. It was published as a comment to the journal. There were, I think, a dozen comments to the journal by concerned scientists who were rightly concerned for all the various other types of errors that are in there. But we were the only one that spotted that mathematical error. And it's math. You have to recognize that you made that error and that you're badly interpreting something, okay? When you have something that blows up that should be going to zero, there's something wrong. Well, guess what? They responded, and I think today it was published in the journal, and they did not acknowledge that they made an error. They did not mention that we pointed out this error. They simply said that we didn't understand models, and that their conclusion is a conclusion that obviously arises from the standard model, and they quoted their final conclusion at the end here and didn't mention everything. It's what I would call a cover-up, okay? So they lawyered themselves out of addressing the very direct challenge, which is, look here, you have introduced an ad-hoc parameter that cannot possibly mean what you say it means. There are absurdities that arise. It's defined in a way that it cannot mean that. And most of your interpretation relies on that parameter. And every time you rely on that parameter, you're making statements of interpretation that are false, that are incorrect. They didn't address any of that. So that convinced me that these scientists are not playing by the rules of honesty, and that they are behaving in an unethical way. I am concerned that one of the co-authors is a graduate student, is a PhD candidate, and that they are therefore training the next generation of scientists to behave in this way and to use lawyered arguments instead of science. And I am appalled by the whole thing. And Byram Bridle has done a fantastic job of pointing out that even if you were to say, well, okay, there are no errors in the math, the parameters you're using are completely wrong. And if you change those parameters, you can invert your conclusions, which is correct. So I admire all the scientists that spoke out. I'm thankful for them. But I am beside myself that you can have this kind of an egregious and obvious error, obvious to anyone who understands mathematics of these types of models, and that it gets published. And then when you point it out to the authors, they do not even address your criticism. I am disgusted by the whole thing. So there is a big problem at this journal if this is the kind of paper that they're accepting, and they're not recognizing that there is a fundamental, a fatal problem here, a fatal flaw in the paper, and a fundamental problem in their process if they're going to be publishing this kind of political crap. So that is essentially what I wanted to say. I'm done, and I want to thank you for letting me vent in this way. But
that was awesome. Can you talk just for a quick minute about the paper that you're going to write and try to submit to them to see if they publish it? Otherwise, you'll go to a different journal. Just for 1 minute about that.
Yes. Well, Dr. Hickey and I have decided, when we saw this trash, lawyerish response of how they responded to our criticism, we said, well, in that case, we have to formally submit a scientific paper to the same journal and ask the question whether this parameter, this so-called unvaccinated contribution to infectious risk, psi, is a correct parameter that can be used to elucidate mixing and dynamics of infections. So we're going to directly address it in a paper that is entirely about that, and ask, is this parameter that they've introduced for the first time, now that it's in the scientific literature, is this something you can do? What does it mean? Is it useful? Or is it a load of you know what? And so we're going to write a paper to that effect, submit it to the same journal. That's our plan anyway. Sometimes reality gets in the way, but that is our plan. And we'll see what the journal does with it. And we'll see how they handle it.
So a couple of questions. I'm going to kind of try to merge a couple of questions that came up in the chat, but basically, is there anything that can be done to hold him and the journal accountable? That it's not just swept under the rug, that you write your paper and then they just go, okay, we'll retract it. You know, like the hydroxychloroquine paper, where they just suddenly took it away and then the damage was already done. They should not be able to use this research as justification for policy. So is there a way to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Well, I'll give a technical answer, which is just my opinion. And I think the most forceful thing that one could do is to use the institutions that are there to protect the public. And what I mean by that is, here is a group of scientists who have really been irresponsible, who have made political statements that have had big impact. So especially if you can show that this paper is actually being used by politicians, has been put out in the media, and is potentially causing actual real harm, okay? If you can show that to society, and given the nature of this paper and the behavior of the authors, one could file a complaint to the order of what's it called, the CPSO, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. One would have to read the act and file a complaint directly to the disciplinary committee to say, look, this behavior is contrary to professional ethics. There is no way that you've got to discipline this person. And I think if you were to make a strong and well-structured complaint of that nature, that is completely respecting that institutional protection that we have through that institution, you might be able to make some a headway there. And such a decision would really send a strong signal to other scientists who want to behave in this way that they shouldn't. Because if you can cause harm in the society, then and you do it in this reckless fashion, and you don't, and when people take the time to point out your errors, you don't even recognize that an error was made, then I think there's a problem. And so that would be one way to address it. The other way would be to have a public campaign to get the journal to acknowledge that it made a mistake, that it did a shoddy job, that it should have spotted this obvious mathematical error. You do not, the whole idea of peer review is that you don't publish outright errors in the scientific literature. So there was a failing there. There could be a public campaign to get them to recognize that and to explicitly put the correction in their journal. Those are my thoughts on it. Just my opinions, but yeah, that's the kind of thing that I would do.
Well, you've had some legal experience, so I think that your opinions are probably pretty bang on. So we have two hands up, and I will let two questions happen now, and then I'm going to have everyone else's questions at the very end, because Denis has to go soon. And so Sarah and Mara, I want to just remind you that I'm recording, and so if you don't want your face, then turn your camera off. Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for this. So I was just wondering that could a paper also be written showing why science without ethics training is disastrous, by referring to some of the research ethics violations that they have committed.
One can always write such an article, but that would be appropriate for an ethics journal. I think the more important point for me as a scientist is that science without science is unacceptable. Okay, never mind ethics. Science without science is unacceptable. This is not science. I have supervised many graduate students, many of whom became researchers, university professors, and so on. They were my students. And boy, I'll tell you, it was all about intellectual honesty and it was all about rigor. And you didn't get anything by the committee. And so I do not understand how in this day and age, this kind of thing can happen. This is science without science.
Mara, go ahead.
So I just wanted to give some factual information about college complaints. At the moment, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario is legally required to investigate all complaints. They don't even have to make sense. An investigation is required. So the threshold for filing a complaint with the CPSO is different than it is in other provinces. So just wanted to point that out.
I'd like to ask you a question
Yes.
In response to that, since you seem to know about the procedure. I know the procedure very well in Quebec, the Collège des Médecins de Québec, but in Ontario, I know it more superficially. In Quebec, a private complainant can go directly to the disciplinary committee and make a complaint directly to them. In other words, say, I don't care about your investigation. I don't care about asking an investigator to take care of this for me or anything. In any way, I think they're going to brush it off, or I think they're going to cover it up. I'm going to go straight to the disciplinary committee. Can you do that in Ontario?
No, you cannot.
Oh.
No.
Really?
Yeah, there's no public access to the discipline committee. So many different things have to happen before a complaint will go to the discipline committee.
When it goes to the disciplinary committee, is it carried by the investigator or is it carried by the person?
So the complaint that is made, in a sense, belongs to the college, and they will investigate it.
Right.
Depending on the nature of it, they will sometimes investigate it, even if the person says they don't want it to be investigated anymore. Sure. Sorry, I just have to tell my dog that maybe he should not be barking right now.
So as I understand it, Mara, yeah, they carry it like your union would carry your grievance.
Yes.
And of course, their purpose in the statute is to protect the public. So they're going to carry it even if you say, oh, I don't want to do it anymore. They might still.
They could potentially do that,
yes,
depending on the nature of it. Yeah.
But the thing is, in that case, what you would do is you would hold them to doing a proper investigation. And so you're looking at judicial review then, right?
Well, yes. So if they choose not, so it goes to the a committee called the ICRC, Investigation of Complaints, and then the ICRC decides whether or not to put it forward to the discipline committee. So the ICRC may decide not to put it forward, and that could potentially be subject to judicial review at HBARB. So there's also a committee that does not get used very often, but may be used for complaints such as these. And that is the frivolous and vexatious complaint, so that somebody is making a complaint because they have a personal vendetta. But even that is an investigation.
What you mean is that they can use that as a pretext not to investigate or not to take it any further. Is that?
I want to be careful about the language. Yeah. The college may make the decision that a complaint is frivolous and vexatious.
Right, so they'll put an end to it.
And they will put an end to it. As a person subject to a complaint, not just one, the process is very grueling for the physician. It is done. I have not seen a complaints process done improperly. That's not to say that it doesn't happen, but in my experience with the college, I have not seen it happen that a complaints process is done improperly or that the steps are not followed. It's a very procedural. It's very procedurally based.
That's a big difference with Quebec. In Quebec, the syndic, the investigator, can do a sloppy job because he's got the pretext, I think, in the back of his mind that you can always go directly to the disciplinary committee. Yeah. So they do a lot of sloppy work.
The investigators at the college are really quite they're quite skilled and the work that they do. Again, not talking about the content of it, but the process of it.
So in a case like this, it's all about how you construct the originally filed complaint so that the investigators know exactly what you're complaining about. It's well structured, you have evidence, they can get more as part of their investigation, but it's all about making sure you're on top of it and really putting
Yes.
something in that's solid.
Because
And-
there's a limit to the kind of complaint a public member can make when the physician in question is not their physician. So it is usually, this is a physician, there are medical records,
Right.
but there are certain violations of behavior. And this is where I think it would be great for people to look in the guidelines of the College of the Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, behavioral guidelines for physicians in public and in general, that where somebody who is not a patient can file a complaint. So these are all ways to make your voice heard through the college.
In a case of public interest where you're going that route, because this is not my treating physician here, is it important does the investigator have to prove that actual harm was caused? Or is it enough that this is reckless behavior and could have caused harm?
So it isn't the investigator.
Sorry, and we'll move on right after
that. It's not up to the investigator. The investigator will complete their investigation and then it will go to the ICRC committee. And then it could potentially go on to a discipline committee. So the investigator puts their information together and it's a separate committee that decides on the validity of the complaint.
Yeah, that wasn't quite my question, but I understand that we're getting into a legalistic argument. So I think we'll stop. But this is fascinating, and I think that's the way to go. Use the institutions that are there to protect the public, and use them fully and completely and competently, and you will get results.
Awesome.
I'm talking from experience.
Yes, I know you are. Yes. All right. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. And again, everybody, you were emailed. Everybody was sent an email with a bunch of links. I did put them in the chat as well. Edward, I do see that your hand is up, but I do want to move on to Byram.
I do want to present my co-author, Joseph.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I did meant to mention Joseph. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'll just say hi, everyone, so you can see me. Great job, Denis, expressing what we put in our paper there, our criticism. So,
thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, we didn't end up with very much time to.
I mean, I have to say that we make quite a team, Joseph and I. We are both very challenging of each other, and we make sure that everything is completely right before we make a statement. And we have a lot of fights and arguments, and we do a lot of calculations and make a lot of graphs. And that little paper that we wrote is the result of an enormous amount of work.
Yes, I'm absolutely sure that it is.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
My
I am going to give the floor to Bonnie Millard, Dr. Bonnie Millard, who is going to introduce Dr. Byram Bridle, who is going to talk about the other aspects of the paper that are wrong.
So it's a real privilege of mine this evening to introduce Dr. Bridle, even though he really doesn't need an introduction. However, we've got close to 300 people on the call tonight. So there may be some people that aren't familiar with Dr. Bridle. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to introduce him. I will say, if you were actually looking at his CV, which is like about 40 pages long, it would take us like a half hour. So obviously I'm just going to give a few highlights so you know his credentials. So his PhD is from the University of Guelph, specializing in immunology and transplantation biology with real expertise in a topic called immunological tolerance, which becomes really important these days when we're talking about some of the effects of these vaccines. After his PhD, he went to McMaster for a postdoctoral fellow where he worked in viral immunology and cancer biology. Following that, in 2012, he became a faculty member in the Department of Pathobiology at the University of Guelph, and he was hired as a viral immunologist and also to participate in the cancer team there. And he has established a well-funded research program, and he's had many recognitions as a rising star investigator, and he's received also teaching awards So he won the Norden Distinguished Teaching Award fairly early on in his career. He's also won the Terry Fox Research Institute New Investigator Award and a Zoetis Researcher Award. He supervised dozens of graduate students and undergrad, and he's published a myriad of peer-reviewed papers in a vast array of highly acclaimed journals. But I think Byram has been best known now for his brilliant mind, his compassionate heart, and his courageous spirit. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he has become a well-known truth seeker, and I would say a Canadian hero, always presenting the science in a very objective way. And so please welcome Dr. Bridle as he talks to us tonight about the Fisman paper.
Hi, Bonnie. Thank you very much for that introduction. Wendy, can you confirm that you can see my
Yeah.
screen?
I can see it. It's not in presentation mode. There, now it is. Yep. And
Okay.
we hear your snack.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, thanks everybody. Just as Bonnie was introducing me, I was just finishing up my most recent vaccine dose. I just thought you might be interested. This vaccine actually is manufactured by a company called Ayogo. And this particular vaccine is, this one's cherry flavored. And just so you can see, earlier today, I had I don't know if you can see there, I had a vanilla flavored vaccine. So I vaccinate myself multiple times a day, apparently. And I'll explain that to you. And because you're probably wondering how is yogurt as a vaccine relevant to the Fisman paper? Well, I'll tell you, it's very relevant. Because as an immunologist, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to buy into this idea of teaching my students in the future that yogurt is a vaccine. And yet that's what I'm being asked to do. And what I mean by that is a lot of people don't realize that on September 1st, 2021, so much less than 1 year ago, the United States Centers for Disease Control changed the definition of a vaccine to accommodate the current COVID-19 inoculations. And I'll show you this. So I previously, prior to this declared pandemic, I didn't even know what the Wayback Machine was. Now I use it all the time so that I can figure out what what existed previously, and oftentimes what the truth was then versus what the purported truth is now. So this it shows on July 4th, the definitions that the Centers for Disease Control had. Now, the definition for immunity has not changed. So notice that the definition of immunity is protection from an infectious disease. All right. And what that means specifically is if immunity has been conferred. So immunity has a very specific term in immunology. If you have become immune, which means immunity has been conferred upon you, then it means you can be exposed to it without becoming infected. So in short, what immunity means is you're protected from the disease and you can't spread the causative agent of that disease to other people. So now, a lot of people then know that with vaccination, this involves introducing a vaccine to your body, right? And as you can appreciate here, it's to induce immunity, which we just talked about. And then immunization is a term that you can use in place of vaccination. Immunization, right? That immuna part comes from immunity, right? It's an injection that confers immunity, protection from the disease, so you don't get the disease and you don't spread the causative agent onto other people. So let's look for a moment at the definition of a vaccine. It's a product that stimulates a person's immune system to produce immunity, which we already talked about, okay? So again, the person's protected from the disease. And again, so you've got to look to immunity again. So a vaccine is something that prevents the disease and prevents transmission of the causative agent. So keep that in mind. That's what I've taught as an immunologist to my students in my university courses for many years now. And notably, this was the definition of a vaccine that was in place at the beginning of the declared pandemic. Also, this is the definition that was in place at the initiation of the clinical trials, the initial phase 3 human clinical trials that are still ongoing. Meaning, keep in mind that when these clinical trials wrap up, these COVID-19 inoculations will be evaluated to see how they performed in terms of, and what a lot of people forget about is the goal in these, the measurement of success of these inoculations as defined in the clinical trials and agreed upon with the regulatory agencies is their ability to prevent symptomatic COVID-19. COVID-19 is the disease, so to prevent the disease, not to blunt the disease or severity of disease, is to prevent the disease. All right, so these are all the definitions that were in place at the beginning. But as I mentioned, less than 1 year ago, the definition was changed to accommodate these inoculations so that they could be called vaccines. And so this has created a lot of problems for us as immunologists. Like I said, to the point now where I've got to call my yogurt a vaccine, and I'll show you exactly why. This is what they did. So you can go to these websites and look for yourself, but the definition of immunity has not changed, right? You see it's still protection from an infectious disease, right? It means, as it states right here, it stayed the same. You can be exposed to it without becoming infected, right? So in other words, it's conferring, what immunity is when you have conferred upon your immune system, we call sterilizing or near sterilizing immunity. That's another, those are other phrases you could use. But look what they've done with vaccine. Remember, the definition of a vaccine was a product that produces immunity in a person. See the term immunity and the definition of vaccine? Now look, when you look at the new definition of vaccine, immunity does not appear there anywhere. Now, apparently, it's merely a preparation, such as this, and you can look at the ingredient list, right? This is a preparation, this yogurt that I have, that is used to stimulate the body's immune response against diseases. Okay, vaccines, note, can be administered by mouth. I mean, this is why. So I take oral vaccines on a daily basis, right? That's what it is here. Mine are administered by mouth, and that's literally what it is. Now you say, oh, come on, a yogurt, like, it's got to stimulate the body's immune response. Well, here you go. I mean, there's thousands of scientific papers. I'll show you one. Yogurt, especially with probiotic bacteria, have induce all kinds of effector responses from the immune system. And these can have a myriad of beneficial effects in the context of all kinds of different diseases. As such, yogurt falls clearly into this new definition of a vaccine. So that's what I want to highlight to you. And the reason why this is important is this, because we're talking about the paper by Fisman et al. That Denis has done a great job of introducing. I would contend that paper would not and could not exist if this definition had not been changed. Now, interestingly, I want you to note something. You see here, immunization still has not changed, right? It can still be used interchangeably with the term vaccination, as you can see here, right? This term is often used interchangeably with vaccination. So this is a problem because they've changed the definition of vaccine. It no longer has to confer immunity, yet immunization, which can be used in place of vaccination, implies immunity. So you can see they've created enormous difficulties for us as immunologists moving forward with our teaching and with the language that we have been using for decades. Nevertheless, again, what I would contend is, think about it. I want you to think about this for a moment. We've all heard the whole purpose, the entire purpose of the vaccines was to use them as a tool to try and confer immunity, right? Because what was the goal? What was and still is stated publicly as a goal? It is to achieve herd what? Immunity. You've heard that term, herd immunity, not immune responses among the human herd, but herd immunity. And that has a very specific meaning. Herd immunity means you don't have to have everybody immune. But if you have a majority of the population immune, you can shut down the spread of an infectious disease. The reason is once you have enough people who are immune, chances of a non-immune individual who's susceptible to the disease encounter a another susceptible person who's infected and can spread the disease gets reduced dramatically, right? Because chances are they're going to be interacting with people who are immune, and they're going to serve as a barrier between them and the people who can spread the disease. That's what herd immunity is. And so vaccines indeed are designed to confer immunity. There's two ways. You can either acquire it naturally following resolution of the disease, or it can be conferred by vaccination. And therefore you get the herd immunity. Now, think about what Denis just talked to you about, and what Wendy introduced at the beginning. The Fisman paper is all about segregating the unvaccinated, avoiding the unvaccinated, or possibly forcing them in some way to get the vaccine because they somehow represent a greater threat to the vaccinated than other vaccinated individuals do. Herd immunity works completely the opposite. And what herd immunity says that once you have had immunity conferred by vaccination or immunity conferred following natural infection, you actually want to co-mingle. You want to get those individuals to co-mingle with the non-immune. The reason is that's how herd immunity works. That's how it stops the transmission. You actually want to promote co-mingling. So it's the complete opposite. So if these things were working as a vaccine, the Fisman paper could not even exist, right? So it's preposterous just from that perspective. Now, we've already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into much details, right? But my concern with this paper is before this paper is published, we already had our population subdivided into two groups, essentially, with very few in between. One group is very frightened, especially of group number 2, right? That they have privileges that group number 2 has. They've been highly misinformed. They seem to be okay with censorship and not having open discussions about science and medicine these days. And the other group finds themselves hated, segregated, they've lost jobs, and they simply want to be able to have open, honest discussions about the science and medicine. And there's lots of other things here. We all have our own things we could add to these lists. But the net result, right, when you have two groups like this, is it's leading to broken marriages, fighting over children, terminated lifelong friendships, a lot of mistrust between the two populations, aggression, loss of respect, right? I think we all know where this could go. And so the key problem here is there's two problems. There's the constant misinformation, disinformation that keeps getting relayed, and I for one, like Denis and many others, are trying to combat this misinformation, disinformation that's out there. But recall, this is all linked to an infrastructure, right? That seems to be using this for some kind of ulterior motives because they don't seem to be following the science. So keep in mind that as you know, the mandates seem to dissipate at the moment, or they're put on pause and only on pause, right? As long as the infrastructure exists, all of this stuff can be rolled out at any time again, or re-amplified. And so that's why I have a real problem then with this paper, because what this paper is doing is it is dramatically amplifying this problem. And so I'm an immunologist, and I'm just going to come at this from a very different perspective than from what Denis did. I appreciate what he and his co-author did. I agree. The model can be dismantled just from the pure modeling mathematical perspective. But I'm going to come at it from my area of expertise, which is the immunological perspective. Now, first of all, I want to point out the journal it was published in is known as the Canadian Medical Association Journal. So this is the journal of the Canadian Medical Association. Now, I want to point out that what many people might not realize is here's an interesting conflict of interest, right? So the Canadian Medical Association entered in the pre-pandemic time, so this was in 2009, with a formal partnership with Pfizer to collaborate on an education program for Canadian physicians, right? And notably, what's interesting is when this article was brought up in social media, within 24 hours, it was taken down. So this is the page that you now see. So again, you'd have to use the Wayback Machine to see this version over here, and they've removed this. They apparently didn't want the Canadian public to see that they had entered into a partnership with Pfizer for educating physicians. So this seems to be a major conflict of interest with the organization that has the journal that's published this paper. Interestingly, the Globe and Mail at the time, journalism still seemed to be, quite balanced, and they asked some tough questions. And here's what the Globe and Mail said at the time, and many other papers. This is just one example of many. But some members of the medical community say the Canadian Medical Association is heading down a dangerous road and warn that partnering with Pfizer Canada may cross a serious ethical line that could negatively influence doctors' treatment decisions. Well, here we are again. I'm not gonna draw any conclusions. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But I'm not going to go over this either because Wendy did a great job. What I was just this just summarizes what Wendy summarized at the beginning, right? This whole concept that with this paper that was published last Monday, Monday of last week, there's sort of two conclusions to it, right? The two key conclusions they draw is the unvaccinated are very dangerous to the vaccinated, therefore they should be isolated from society. The vaccinated should try to avoid them whenever possible. It could lead to interpretations that might be suggestive of things like coercing the unvaccinated to get vaccinated, or applying penalties if they do not, even to an extreme as forced vaccination. But the second conclusion was, therefore, for the vaccinated population, get your boosters, get your booster doses. If you've had 2, get your 3rd. If you've had 3 doses, get your 4th. And now we're talking about rolling out the 5th dose. So I just want to highlight a couple things here. First of all, I just highlight one sentence here from the paper. So take a look at this. However, anti-vaccine sentiment, right? Anti-vaccine, automatically, there's no open discussion about why people might disagree. You're just labeled as an anti-vaxxer, right? Fueled in part by organized disinformation efforts. Of course, nobody could possibly disagree with these because of having conducted, in-depth research and formulating a well-informed opinion, right? And this has resulted in suboptimal uptake of these vaccines. So there's many problems, but this is just an example of rhetoric. This is just pure rhetoric, and rhetoric has no place in a scientific article. I mean, this type of language, Denis covered this very well also. He mentioned this. There's multiple examples. Forget about the science. This kind of language never should have got through the peer review process or by the editor. It's just pure rhetoric. It has no place in science where we're supposed to maintain objectivity. So now what I want to do for you is, from an immunological perspective, just like Denis did, he can break down the model and the math, but I'm just going to show you a couple things from the immunological side that also destroy this story. So, like Denis explained, these epidemiological models can be very powerful in the right hands. They can allow us to predict what might occur. I would argue they're most important when we're really unsure, when we don't have a lot of good data to evaluate. One of the things that I also criticize about this paper is, after more than 2 years, we have lots of data, and we had lots of opportunity to run real biological studies, right? To actually have biological data, real world biological data to help answer these kind of questions. So at this point, at this late stage in the game, to be running a purely theoretical model to try and inform real life decisions doesn't make sense to me from that either. But nevertheless, they did. It's a model and it's mathematical, but these models, so it's literally in an Excel spreadsheet. So it's on your computer. You can run the model. You plug in numbers on one end and you get numbers out the other end, and then you interpret the numbers coming out the other end, and you use those to draw your conclusions. Well, it's typical of anything with a computer. Garbage in equals garbage out. If you put in good data that's really representative of the real world, and like Denis would say, the model has been constructed properly, right? Then you're going to get reasonable outputs that can help predict things in a world where in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty. But in this case, I would contend, I'm going to give you one example of an assumption that they made that led them to not plug in a variable that is undeniable. You can't make this assumption and not plug it into the model. And I'm going to give you a second example where they did a second assumption that they plugged. So this is an example here of an assumption that they made that led them to not plug that into the model. And then there's one where they did plug it into the model. And I would argue that it was a very inappropriate assumption that was plugged in. So in this case, this is just intuitive. You just look at this one sentence. We did not model waning immunity. So in other words, the assumption here is the current COVID-19 inoculations, they induce an immune response and it never wanes. I mean, intuitively, that's utterly ridiculous. I mean, otherwise, why are we on the 3rd and 4th and now talking about the rollout of 5th doses among the elderly? People knew immediately. You don't have to be an expert. As soon as they saw these few words here in this sentence, they could see something was really wrong. And worse, not only do all immune responses wane, but this is the key thing, they wane differentially between the two groups that were evaluated in the model. So what I mean by that is these COVID-19 inoculations that we currently have have a very short duration of immunity. So what that means is duration of immunity is how long you're protected after you receive a vaccine. If you think about every previously mandated vaccine, and again, we go back to the definition of a vaccine, so they were actually vaccines, right? And these current inoculations prior to September of last year, right, would not even be qualified as vaccines. And that's accurate because they don't look anything like previously mandated vaccines. So think about the childhood series. Once you're done your childhood series, you don't get boosted again for the rest of your life typically. The immunity is conferred for the remainder of your life. And yet, especially when it comes to these booster doses, we know that the immunity wanes in about as little as 2 months. I mean, that is a ridiculously rapid waning of immunity. In contrast, the immunity conferred by natural infection with SARS coronavirus 2 is much longer lasting. So not only did they make the inappropriate choice if you're wanting your conclusions to be relevant to the real world situation, not only did they not did they make this assumption that immunity doesn't wane, but if you were actually to plug it into the model, you would plug in a differential effect, right? So again, you would enter into your model much faster waning of vaccine-induced, quotes, vaccine-induced immunity versus the natural immunity. And when that is done, it completely changes the output of the model, right? Because garbage in, garbage out, or in this case, if you don't put in a critical and important assumption that should be there, right, you end up with a very different output. Now, secondly, when it comes to natural immunity, this is incredible. I want to point out that when it comes to natural immunity, so many people don't even accept this anymore. Remarkably, I'm going to show you something. This is Instagram. The hashtag natural immunity has been severely limited in its use in the social media because guess what? People have been misusing it. I mean, people have been implying that it's a real thing. That, you know, can you imagine the miracle of considering that our immune system can actually function in the absence of external hand of man manipulation, you know, through things such as vaccines. But the reality is, I can tell you as an immunologist that our immune systems do work. And if you are infected, naturally, you can recover from that and generate an immune response, and arguably a superior immune response to what's induced by these inoculations. So now when we look at that, so fine, they at least did take into consideration some degree here of natural immunity. But what did they plug into the model? They said, okay, let's say of the unvaccinated people, 20% have naturally acquired immunity. Okay, so you say, where did they get that from? How accurate is that of the real world? Well, when you look at the reference that they used for this, the reference was assumption. That this means they literally pulled it out of thin air. They have no scientific article to justify it. You can see here's another assumption that was made, but I'm not going to focus on this, right? So assumptions, you have to be very concerned about assumptions because literally they pulled this out of thin air. So I want to argue, here's a paper. So the chair of our Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee for the Canadian COVID Care Alliance is Dr. Stephen Pellick, and he co-authored this paper that was published some time ago. Now look, I have highlighted in yellow here a sentence. We determined that more than 90% of uninfected adults showed antibody reactivity against the spike protein. This is what's targeted by the current COVID-19 inoculations. But not only that, also against other proteins from the SARS coronavirus 2. So here I've shown you, instead of an assumption, they're playing with thin air, I've shown you a great publication that suggests 90%. And I want to point out that since this time, we have had record-shattering waves of the Delta variant come through our population and the Omicron variant. I would be surprised if there's anybody left after living with this virus for more than 2 years who hasn't been exposed to this virus and has some degree of natural immunity. I would argue it's probably well over 90%. But what I want to point out then is if you take their assumption of 20%, which seems ridiculously low, and you replace it with something more appropriate, and you can pick whatever number you want. I don't care what the number is, but so you can pick 60%, 65, 70. You know, I picked 85. I showed you a number from Stephen Pellick's paper saying 90. So I thought, you know, I don't want to push the limits. I'm going to be conservative, so I'll put in 85%. But you know, the point is, you can pick a different number that's much more reasonable, and I can point to a scientific article rather than just saying I'm pulling this off the top of my head. I'm just, you know, picking out a number that I like. And this is very important. So now look what happens. When you change this one variable from 20% to 85% immunity among the unvaccinated, this is what happens. This is the output in one of the columns. And all you need to appreciate here is this is a ratio. And as you can appreciate, the ratio starts off at 1. What they've done is they've simulated an outbreak of a variant of the SARS coronavirus 2 among the population. And so you can imagine at the start, everything's equal. So a ratio of 1 means if you're looking at unvaccinated versus vaccinated, for example, then it means it's equal between the two groups, okay? So that's all you have to understand with the ratio. 1 means everything's equal. As soon as it goes above 1, right, that means everything's in favor of one of the two groups. But then on the other hand, if it goes below 1, right, then the reverse has happened, right? The other group now is having that occur more often. And so you don't have to understand the science or all the modeling details here. What I think you can appreciate is when they put in 20%, they got this ratio. Look at the ratio, all above 1, right? So all going in one direction. And then when you change it to 85%, look what happens, right? All of a sudden, it literally reverses, right? The ratio goes in favor of the other way. And that's what I want to show to you, because this is a classic example of garbage in, garbage out. You can, if you don't use these models properly, and that's assuming they're set up properly, and Denis will tell you right from the get-go that it wasn't set up properly, right? But that aside, if you were to assume a model was set up properly and you start pulling numbers out of thin air and plugging them in, especially, see, this is what's unreasonable. There is no way that they should have got away in this paper with just plugging in, for example, 20% natural immunity. They should have looked at the literature and saw, you know what, it could be substantial immunity. We have no idea. We admitted it's an assumption, so we have no idea. Even if you notice, I'll show you this. They even put in here, when you actually go to their model, their assumed plausible range, but they give no reference, is 10 to 50%. If you put in 50%, that ratio starts shifting dramatically, right? But they didn't show that in the model. They ran one iteration, right, and then drew this conclusion. And the problem is that when you can change one input to something that is biologically plausible and defensible, and you completely flip the results on its head, that also means you flip the conclusions on their head, right? And so then how could you get away with publishing one set of conclusions, right? That's my point. So this is a classic example of garbage in, garbage out. Now, I want to finish here with everybody with saying, once you're done your modeling, especially when we have accumulated more than 2 years of data, you have to start asking yourself, how well does the model predict the real world? So here's the real world here, right? Because David Fisman and his co-authors have concluded at the end, one of their conclusions is, therefore, because of this leprous, unvaccinated population, one of the things you can do to protect yourself, in addition to segregating them, is you can get boosters. So that's what his model told him, right? This is one of the conclusions he should draw. So let's look at this public health data from Ontario. This is taken right from the website for the Ministry of Health, Ontario Ministry of Health. And what you will notice is that you have 3 lines here. Now I want to point out this top green line because it's the most dramatic here. What this is there's 3 groups here, 3 populations, and these are the cases of COVID-19 being diagnosed per 100,000 people within each of these groups. So it's normalized for the differences in the sizes of the group. So you can do a direct comparison between them. So what it means is if you're in this population represented by the green line, you have more than a 2-fold higher chance of being diagnosed with COVID-19. COVID-19 is being diagnosed more than 2 times more often in this green group than these groups. All right. And so when you look at that, you say, so in other words, you ask yourself, do you want to be in the green group or do you want to be down here? Well, of course you want to be down here. You want to have less than half the chance of being diagnosed with COVID-19. So of course you do not want to be in this horribly, unprotected, unvaccinated group, right? And that's, of course, the assumption you would make if Fisman's model was correct. But now let me unblind the labels. And what you see, wow, the green here is vaccinated with booster doses. This completely contradicts the conclusion of the Fisman paper, but hey, it actually matches, Dr. Bridle's conclusion when he corrects one inappropriate immunological assumption, right? So I'll leave you to draw the conclusion as to whose output better matches the real life data. And so I just want to finish with this. Think about this for a moment. So if this is the case, this is the first time. I would say kudos to the authors of this paper, because it's the first time.
While we're waiting for him to come back, I will just mention one part of the interview that Denis and Byram did with Trish Wood. It's one of the links that I had emailed to everybody if you wanted to watch the interview. But one of the things that I thought that Byram talked about that was awesome, he talked about people getting vaccines to travel. And so in this paper, they talked about how we need to keep the unvaccinated and the vaccinated separate because the vaccinated are getting sick and it's too risky for them to be around these people. But when you get a vaccine for something like yellow fever and then you go travel, you are purposely going into the area where there's infection. And the point of getting the vaccine is that it protects you from that infection. So with the COVID vaccines, if the vaccinated people aren't safe, it sounds like the conclusion of the paper should be that the vaccine is not effective, right? Like, so for them to conclude that, okay, this is a good justification for getting more boosters, it just seems crazy. Oh, I see Byram.
I went in back. Yes, I'm sorry, everybody. Can I just wrap up? Can I just wrap up really quick?
Yes.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't realize my battery just suddenly died. So sorry about that, everybody.
That's okay.
Yes, so I'll wrap up really quick, Wendy. So just to finish, I just wanted to highlight something that's really important here for everybody to think about, right? And with you've heard the messaging now from Denis, and I've given you a completely different approach to this. You can see multiple different approaches from different areas of expertise all demonstrate that this paper is flawed, and I agree with Denis that this paper should be by all rights retracted. It should never have been published to begin with. But this is the important thing. As I was saying, kudos to the authors for releasing this, but this is the first time that I've been able to see an epidemiological model since the beginning of this declared pandemic. And I've been trying, and I've been asking the epidemiological modelers over and over again, what are the immunological assumptions that you are plugging into your models? Because these models have dictated our lives now for more than 2 years. And think about it. So we can't use this model to prove that the previous models were also flawed, but I want everybody to remember, Dr. David Fisman was a key member of the Ontario Science Table. And specifically, he was a member of their modeling group. So he's been critically involved in all of the models that have been used to advise on our COVID-19 lockdown policies. And so if this is at all representative of the type of modeling that was done previously, it would suggest that they could have been very flawed. And if nothing else, what it proves is what I said. If those models were set up incorrectly, Denis would tell you if they were either set up incorrectly, if they had inherent flaws in the model, or I would say if they were plugging in completely inappropriate assumptions to try and predict real world outcomes, then they were giving improper outputs, right? It would be the classic example, garbage in, garbage out. And so my final conclusion is, as Canadians, I think it is absolutely essential when one finally sees a model released and you see how erroneous it was, I think we have to insist that never again should Canadians be forced to endure any kind of health-related policy that dramatically affects our lives until such time as that model has been released in its entirety, so that experts such as Denis and his co-author, right, can evaluate it, right? So the modelers, the expert modelers can evaluate the models, and all of the scientists who understand the relevant inputs for the models, right, have had a chance to look at what the assumptions are, the data that are being plugged into the model. Until Canadian scientists and physicians have an opportunity to review it and make sure that the model seems reasonable and the data being plugged into it is reasonable, I would argue that we should never have to endure policies they're dictated by the outputs of anonymous epidemiological models ever again. And I'll leave it at that, Wendy.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, I think that the assumptions. Yeah, there's one thing that I want to just have you clarify, just because I think it's an important point. When they're looking at the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated, one of the things that I felt like they were doing is they were assuming that the vaccinated people had immunity and the unvaccinated didn't. So can you just talk for a second about how vaccinated versus unvaccinated does not mean immunity versus non-immune?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so specifically, what the assumption that they made, as I showed, is they actually assumed 20% of the unvaccinated have immunity. But I showed an example of why that's probably a dramatic underestimation.
Right.
But you're right, Wendy. We have to consider it this way. And actually, somebody who could really comment on this is Dr. Bonnie Millard, who introduced me. She's an expert when it comes to immunogenetics, and therefore genetic related variability in immune responses. And so what's very important for people to understand is when you have an outbred population like people, right? We're very diverse. We've had different environmental exposures. We're all genetically different. What happens then is when you respond to something that's designed to induce an immune response, at a population level, will respond according to a bell-shaped curve, right? A classic bell-shaped curve. And what that means is, if it's a vaccine, for example, most people are going to respond moderately well, right? They're going to mount a moderately robust immune response. And then you're going to have a small fraction of population that we call the high responders. They're going to mount a very robust immune response. But on the other end is a small part of the population that we call either the non or low responders. They're either not going to respond at all, or they're going to mount such a low magnitude response that it's simply not protective at all. And that's important because, well, like you mentioned, Wendy, what actually counts, this is what I pointed out, what counts towards herd immunity is in fact that immunity. So what I'm saying is arguably naturally induced immunity is, there's inherent risks to being infected with a pathogen, but if you're able to successfully clear that pathogen, in theory, that immunity should be more robust than the vaccine-induced immunity. Again, we use that quotation marks with these current inoculations, because it's targeting multiple components of the virus. We now know it's much longer lasting. And we know that naturally, we're probably getting qualitatively, if not superior, at least qualitatively appropriate immune responses. And so most people who have actually cleared the infection are going to be well protected. And then on the other hand, you have people who are walking around with these certificates, right, that say that somebody has signed off on that certificate saying that they saw 2 needles go into somebody's shoulder, right? But based on what I just described to you, you can have somebody who has 2 needles that go into their shoulder, but they aren't immune. They aren't protected at all, right? But they've had all these privileges confirmed upon them. They have not been segregated. And then you can have somebody who naturally cleared the infection, and you don't even necessarily know, especially in children. A lot of times they've been infected and they didn't even realize it, because for a lot of individuals, we have learned that this is not even really a pathogen. It doesn't actually cause the disease COVID. They've been infected, and even asymptomatic or very mild infections, especially in children, cause them to mount what appear to be quite protective immune responses. So yes, you can't discount the potency of natural immunity, nor can you be assured or guaranteed of immunity just because you have a certificate saying you got 2 jobs.
Exactly. Thank you. I wanted to make sure that that was very clarified. We have lots of hands up, and so I'm going to end the recording now. So at this point in time, then everybody can feel free to comment and ask questions. But thank you very, very much for this presentation. It was amazing. And yeah, I think that we've all learned quite a lot about the analysis of this research paper.